a guilty verdict in a first-of-its-kind murder trial in Dallas County. Prosecutors using what's called forensic genetic genealogy to link a suspect to a killing from the 1980s.
She would have given you her last dollar if you had asked for it, but you didn't. You took her dignity and life instead. She was 78 years old. We all lost a loving family member, a mother, a grandmother, an aunt, and a sister.
For 33 years, he went to sleep every night knowing exactly what he did to that woman. And for 33 years, nobody came knocking. Not once. That changes today. January 19th, 1989. Oak Cliff, Dallas, Texas. A family member walks into a house that should feel familiar. The dogs are inside, but something about them is wrong. They won't settle. They keep circling back toward the bedroom. Ears low, restless in the way animals get when something in a space has shifted permanently. He follows them. Nothing looks disturbed. No broken windows, no overturned furniture. Just a house that feels suddenly, quietly wrong in a way he cannot yet name. Then he notices a suitcase under the guest bed, pushed out just slightly further than it should be. He kneels down. And that is the moment this story truly begins. What he found underneath that bed would launch one of the longest cold case investigations in Dallas County history. A case that would outlast careers, survive multiple dead ends, and ultimately be cracked open not by a tip, a confession, or a witness, but by science that didn't even exist when the crime was committed. And when investigators finally got their answer, they discovered the man responsible had been standing just feet from Mary Hague Kelly's front door the entire time. But before we get there, and we will get there is something you need to understand about this case, something the original detectives in 1989 could not have known, and something that, looking back now, raises a question that should make every one of you deeply uncomfortable. Was there a clue sitting right in front of them from day one that nobody acted on? We are going to walk through every layer of this investigation, the forensic evidence, the cold case revival, the science that rewrote the rules of criminal identification, and the trial that made Dallas County legal history. And by the end of this video, you will have everything you need to form your own verdict on how this case was handled. Before we go any further, if you are a new viewer, this channel covers real criminal cases and real investigations in depth, so subscribe now. Today's case involves the murder and sexual assault of a 78-year-old woman. The details are disturbing, though we will keep this breakdown factual and respectful throughout. If that is not something you are comfortable with right now, no pressure at all. But if you are ready to go deep on one of the most remarkable cold case resolutions in recent Texas history, then stay with us. Drop a comment and tell us where in the world you are watching this from. We have got viewers in countries we never expected, and we love knowing who is in the room with us. Now, let's go back to Oak Cliff, 1989, and start from the very beginning. Her name was Mary Hague Kelly. She was 78 years old, and she lived alone at 411 North Francis Street, near West 8th Street in West Oak Cliff, Dallas, Texas. Before retirement, she worked as a seamstress, specifically making drapes for interior designers across the city. It was precise, patient work, and by every account she was good at it. After her husband passed away, she continued living in the same home, in the same neighborhood, surrounded by the same people who had known her for years. She weighed approximately 80 pounds. In the one known photograph of her, preserved by her family and shared by Sonny Stinchcomb from the family's personal records, she is wearing a ruffle-neck blouse and a heart locket. She looks exactly like what the people who knew her said she was. Warm, present, someone who belonged exactly where she was. Prosecutors at trial described her as a caring and beloved grandmother. Her neighbors and family said the same. She was not isolated. Family rotated check-ins regularly, making sure she was all right. Her sister, Anita Stinchcomb, was among the people closest to her. That care, that routine of checking in, is the only reason anyone noticed something was wrong when it was. On the evening of January 19th, 1989, Mary had not answered her phone all day. For a woman her family checked on consistently, that silence was enough to send someone to her door. Mary's family had a system. They checked in regularly, rotating visits and phone calls to make sure she was doing well. So when she did not answer her phone on January 19, 1989, the silence registered immediately. A family member drove to 411 North Francis Street to check on her in person. He had a key. He let himself in. When Dallas police officers arrived, they were met by several people already at the scene. This was not a solitary discovery. Multiple family members had gathered by the time the call went out. But it was that one family member who had gone in first, followed the dogs, and found her. Because the dogs would not settle. That detail matters. They kept circling toward the bedroom, low and restless, the way animals behave when something is irreversibly wrong in a space they know well. He followed them in. The room looked undisturbed at first glance. Nothing overturned, nothing visibly out of place. Then he looked at the guest bed. A suitcase that was normally stored beneath it was pushed out slightly, just a few inches further than it should have been. He knelt down to look underneath. That is where he found Mary Hague Kelly. Dallas Police Department officers secured the scene. The Dallas County Medical Examiner's Office was called in. The autopsy that followed determined the cause of death to be strangulation. Examination findings included fractures to the thyroid cartilage and the hyoid bone, the small U-shaped bone that sits at the base of the tongue and is highly vulnerable to pressure applied to the neck. Petechiae were also present around her eyes, the tiny burst blood vessels that are a recognized indicator of strangulation. Mary had defensive wounds on her hands, confirming she had fought back. A sexual assault examination was conducted. Biological evidence was recovered from her robe and confirmed positive through lab testing. A sexual assault kit was collected and preserved. 2 separate cords were also recovered from the bedroom. Those cords would not become significant for decades. Several items were missing from the home: her purse, her jewelry, an antique phone she kept in the house, and her 1980 Chevrolet Monte Carlo. The car turned up a few days later, abandoned in a church parking lot not far from the neighborhood. The windows had been broken out. The radio had been stripped from the dashboard. Inside, investigators found empty beer cans, items that had no connection to Mary Hague Kelly whatsoever. The car was processed for fingerprints. Nothing usable came back. The scene had been left by someone who believed they had covered their tracks completely. What investigators could not yet know was that the evidence already collected contained everything needed to identify him. The science to read it just had not arrived yet. Dallas police worked the case hard in the weeks that followed. Fingerprints were lifted from throughout the house and submitted for comparison against criminal records on file. Nothing matched. Several persons of interest were identified and interviewed, including the family member who had discovered Mary. He was cleared quickly. Every name investigators looked at led to the same place, a dead end. The case file was submitted to the FBI's Violent Criminal Apprehension Program, known as VICAP. This is a national system specifically designed to identify patterns across jurisdictions, to flag whether a crime in one city shares enough characteristics with crimes in another to suggest a common perpetrator. No match came back. No pattern was flagged. Pawn shops across Dallas were contacted in the hope that Mary's stolen jewelry or belongings had surfaced somewhere. Nothing came up. Every avenue the investigation had available to it in 1989 was pursued, and every one of them closed without a result. The biological evidence collected from the scene, the sexual assault kit, the material from Mary's robe, and the 2 cords recovered from the bedroom, was preserved. But in 1989, DNA profiling for criminal casework barely existed in any practical form. Investigators could confirm that biological evidence was present at the scene. They had no method to convert that evidence into a name or a suspect. The science needed to do that was still years away from being applicable in a case like this one. By spring of 1989, the active investigation had exhausted every lead available to it. The case went cold. Here is where this story gets uncomfortable. Dallas police had canvassed that neighborhood. They knocked on doors, they spoke to residents, and the house directly next door to Mary Hague Kelly's home at 411 North Francis Street, the house right there, a few feet from her front door, was home to a family that included a young man of approximately 20 years old. His name was David Rojas. He was living there at the time of the murder. No connection between that household and the crime was ever documented in the original investigation. And because Rojas apparently had no criminal record at that point, there was nothing that would have flagged him, even if his name had been noted. So here is the question, and we want you to answer this in the comments. If investigators had collected elimination DNA samples from every resident in the immediate surrounding area, rather than simply interviewing them, would that evidence have given the science a starting point when it finally caught up years later? The technology to test those samples did not exist in 1989. That is a fact. But the proximity of that house to Mary's front door is also a fact. Think about that. And if you are finding this level of detail valuable, the kind of breakdown that goes beyond headlines, subscribe right now. This is what we do every single week. Do not miss what is coming next in this case, because the next chapter is where everything starts to shift. 15 years passed. The case file sat. The evidence sat with it. But not everyone had moved on. In 2004, the investigation into Mary Hague Kelly's murder was revisited. The man at the center of that effort was Dr. Jeffrey Barnard, Director and Chief Medical Examiner of Dallas County at the Southwestern Institute of Forensic Sciences, known as SWIFS. Barnard had been the medical examiner who handled Mary's original autopsy in 1989. He had maintained the records and the preserved biological samples across all those years. And by 2004, the DNA technology that had been essentially unusable for criminal casework in 1989 had advanced to the point where a real attempt was possible. Scientists worked with the preserved evidence and successfully developed a male DNA profile. That profile was uploaded into CODIS, the Combined DNA Index System, the national database that stores DNA profiles from convicted offenders and uses them to match against crime scene evidence submitted from across the country. It was the most powerful investigative tool available at the time for a case like this one. No match came back. Whoever had killed Mary Hague Kelly had never been arrested for any offense that placed his DNA into that system. The profile was real, specific, and scientifically sound. But without a matching entry in the database, it pointed to no one. The name behind it remained completely unknown. The case went quiet again. Not closed, not forgotten. Quiet. And Dr. Barnard still did not let it go. He went back through years of manual case logbooks by hand and built a spreadsheet, his own personal record of unsolved sexual assault homicides he believed could one day be solved if the right technology arrived. Mary's case was on that list. The science he was waiting for was closer than anyone knew. In November 2021, the Dallas County District Attorney's Office made a decision that would change everything. Their Sexual Assault Kit Initiative Unit, the SAKI unit, applied for a grant from a nonprofit organization called Season of Justice, which funds advanced DNA analysis for cold cases through a crowdfunding platform called DNA Solves. The grant was awarded directly to Assistant District Attorney Leighton D'Antoni. It was approved in early 2022, and the preserved evidence from Mary Hague Kelly's 1989 case was sent to a private laboratory in the Woodlands, Texas, Othram Inc. Othram was founded in 2018 with a specific purpose. It is the world's first laboratory built from the ground up exclusively for forensic genetic genealogy work, not adapted from another use. Purpose-built for exactly this kind of case. Michael Vogan, Othram's Director of Case Management, works directly with law enforcement agencies on cases that have exhausted every other option. Mary's case was precisely that. To understand why this mattered, you need to understand what made Othram's approach different from everything that had been tried before. When DNA is uploaded to CODIS, the national database, it uses a limited set of genetic markers, enough to make a direct comparison against profiles already in the system from convicted offenders. If the person you are looking for has never been arrested, their profile is not in CODIS, and the comparison returns nothing. That is exactly what happened in 2004. The profile existed. The name did not. Othram uses a method called forensic-grade genome sequencing. This process reads vastly more of a person's genetic material than standard forensic DNA analysis, producing a profile detailed enough to use for genealogical research. And instead of searching a criminal database, Othram searches public genealogy databases, platforms where ordinary people voluntarily submit their own DNA to trace their ancestry and connect with distant relatives. Platforms similar to Ancestry and 23andMe. Those databases contain millions of profiles submitted by people who have nothing to do with any crime, but who may share a bloodline with someone who does. The technique works by identifying partial matches, not the suspect himself, but his relatives. People who share segments of DNA because somewhere in their family history they share a common ancestor. Working from those partial matches, Othram's in-house genealogy team builds family trees and traces them forward and backward through public records until the branches narrow to a single individual. In Mary's case, the search surfaced a relative at approximately a second cousin-level match. The genealogical work began. Then came a detail that proved critical. That relative shared DNA on the X-chromosome, a chromosome that people inherit exclusively through their maternal line. That single fact allowed investigators to eliminate entire branches of the family tree outright and focus the search on one specific grandmother's line. That grandmother had 11 siblings, 11 separate branches of descendants, each one cross-checked individually against public records. It was slow, painstaking, methodical work, but branch by branch, the search narrowed, until one specific family emerged from the records. And when investigators cross-referenced that family's known address in 1989, it pointed to a house on North Francis Street in Oak Cliff, Dallas, the house directly next door to Mary Hague Kelly. As Leighton D'Antoni would later say, "My job is to aggressively pursue justice in a responsible and ethical manner. Sometimes that requires us to go outside traditional investigative methods to solve our most difficult cold cases." As soon as we discovered the investigative breakthrough potentials that forensic genetic genealogy offered, working with Othram and Season of Justice became a no-brainer. Their results across the country speak for themselves. The case does not get solved without them. If you have made it this far, and this is the level of detail you want every single week, real forensic science, real investigations, broken down completely, subscribe right now. Because what comes next is where 33 years of silence finally ends. The family tree had a name at the end of it, David Rojas. His father had lived directly next door to Mary Hague Kelly at 411 North Francis Street in 1989. Rojas himself had been living there too, approximately 20 years old at the time of the murder. Prosecutors would later confirm this directly in open court. The man investigators had been searching for since January 1989 had spent that winter a few feet from Mary's front door. By 2022, David Rojas was 53 years old and living in Del Rio, Texas, several hours southwest of Dallas. He had no idea that a private laboratory in the Woodlands had just traced a family tree directly back to him. He had no idea that investigators now had his name. The FBI's Dallas division coordinated with local law enforcement in Del Rio and placed Rojas under covert surveillance. For several days, agents watched him go about his life, waiting for a specific opportunity, a discarded biological sample, something he had voluntarily thrown away, something that could be legally collected without a warrant and sent for DNA analysis. The opportunity came when Rojas took out his trash. Agents watched him discard a beer bottle. Once he was gone, they retrieved it. I need you to pause on this detail. Back in 1989, investigators had processed Mary's abandoned 1980 Chevrolet Monte Carlo and found empty beer cans inside, items with no connection to her, left behind by whoever had taken the car. The kind of careless trace a person leaves when they believe no one will ever connect it back to them. The beer bottle recovered from that trash bag in Del Rio was sent by FBI agents directly to SWIFS, the Southwestern Institute of Forensic Sciences in Dallas, for DNA analysis. The results came back on June 28, 2022. A complete match to the male DNA profile recovered from the crime scene 33 years earlier. Investigators did not move immediately. They spent approximately 1 month conducting further investigation to build the case before making their move. On July 22, 2022, David Rojas was arrested and charged with capital murder. He was booked into Dallas County Jail. Bond was set at $750,000. His attorney, Sherrod J. Edwards, declined to comment when contacted by reporters. 33 years. 1 discarded beer bottle. The silence was over. Building the case against David Rojas was not straightforward. There was a forensic complication that the prosecution had to address directly before a jury could ever hear it. Remember those 2 cords recovered from the bedroom in 1989? When they were eventually tested for DNA, they did not return 1 unidentified male profile. They returned 2 on 2 separate cords. That finding introduced a question that any competent defense could exploit. Did a second person play a role in what happened to Mary Hague Kelly that night? The DNA developed from the biological evidence directly linked to Mary's body and her robe pointed to one person only, David Rojas. The cord profiles were a separate forensic matter entirely. Prosecutors led by Leighton D'Antoni had to draw that distinction clearly enough that the anomaly did not fracture the jury's confidence in the primary identification. It was a precise legal and scientific argument that required the full weight of the team behind it. The full investigative coalition behind this prosecution included the Dallas Police Department, the FBI, and the DA's SAKI unit working in coordination. The case was built. Now it had to be proven in court. The trial of David Rojas opened in November 2024 in Dallas County. More than 2 years had passed since his arrest. 35 years had passed since Mary Hague Kelly's death, and this was not just another cold case going to trial. It was the first murder case in Dallas County history to be tried using evidence developed through forensic genetic genealogy. No local precedent existed for how a jury would receive that science. Nobody knew how it would land. Prosecutors made a deliberate decision not to seek the death penalty. Under Texas law, as it stood in 1989, the year the crime was committed, a capital murder conviction without a death sentence carried an automatic life sentence with parole eligibility only after serving 40 years. At 55 years old, Rojas would not be eligible for parole consideration until he was 95. In every practical sense, it was a life sentence. The first major witness to take the stand was Dr. Jeffrey Barnard. He had retired from his position as Dallas County Chief Medical Examiner at SWIFS on November 1, 2024. The trial began the following Monday. After 37 years as the county's Chief Medical Examiner, his final professional act was to walk into a courtroom and testify about a case he had carried since 1989. He described his original autopsy findings and his role in developing the 2004 DNA profile. In his own words, the cause of death was something he had no question about. It was who did it that took 35 years to answer. He told the court that once DNA technology advanced to the point of supporting database comparisons, he went back through the logbooks himself, looking for cases that could finally be solved. DA investigator John Wakefield followed, walking the jury through the complete investigative timeline, from the original 1989 crime scene through the 2004 CODIS upload, the 2021 Saki unit grant application, Othram's genealogical work, the Del Rio surveillance, and the beer bottle that confirmed everything. Throughout all of it, David Rojas sat at the defense table and showed no visible reaction to any testimony presented against him. Leighton D'Antoni delivered the closing argument. He told the jury directly, 20 years of DNA testing all says the same thing. He is the only profile. DNA don't lie. The jury deliberated for just under 2 hours. They returned a verdict of guilty on the charge of capital murder. Judge Layla Lawrence Mays sentenced David Rojas to life in prison. After sentencing, 2 women came forward to address Rojas directly in open court. They were family members he had been separately charged with sexually assaulting his children, approximately 9 and 12 years old at the time of those offenses. They had come forward after his arrest for Mary's murder. One of them looked at him and said, "What you did to me and my sister, especially my mom, what you did to women and children, you're a sick person. That'll be the last time you lay your hands on a woman ever again in your life." While investigators worked and science advanced, Mary Hague Kelly's sister, Anita Stinchcomb, kept making phone calls. For over 3 decades, she contacted law enforcement, asking whether anything had changed. For most of those years, the answer was the same every time. At Mary's funeral, the family had asked that her hands be covered out of respect for the injuries she sustained while fighting back. She was buried alongside her husband, and then the family was left to wait, with no suspect, no answer, and no certainty that one would ever come. When the answer finally arrived, it arrived differently than all those previous calls. The conviction of David Rojas on November 7, 2024, was not just the end of one case. It was the first time Dallas County had ever secured a murder conviction taken all the way through trial using forensic genetic genealogy as the foundation of the evidence. No local precedent had existed before this. Now one does. Leighton D'Antoni said it plainly after the verdict: "The case does not get solved without them, without Othram, without Season of Justice, without the DNA Solves platform that allowed the funding to exist in the first place. That funding model matters beyond this case, because it means government budget constraints no longer have to be the deciding factor in whether a family gets an answer. Private citizens contributing through DNA Solves are now part of the pipeline that solves decades-old murders. That is a structural shift in how cold cases get resolved. Othram's technology is now being used by law enforcement agencies across the United States, Canada, and Australia. The reach of what started as a private lab in the Woodlands, Texas, has extended far beyond any single jurisdiction. And the Mary Hague Kelly case has become one of its most significant examples. Dr. Barnard said the same technology is waiting to do for other victims what it did for Mary. Cold case files are sitting in evidence storage right now with DNA profiles that have no name attached to them. The pipeline is running. January 19, 1989 to November 7, 2024. 35 years between the crime and the conviction, between a family member kneeling down beside a guest bed in Oak Cliff and a jury delivering a guilty verdict in a Dallas County courtroom. A woman who weighed 80 pounds, who spent her working life making drapes for other people's homes, who wore a heart locket in her photograph, and whose sister never once stopped picking up the phone to ask if anything had changed. A killer who walked out of the house next door, moved on, lived freely for over 3 decades, and was ultimately undone by a private lab in Texas, a family tree traced through 11 branches of a grandmother's bloodline, and a beer bottle he threw in the trash without a second thought. The science that solved this case is running on other files right now. Dr. Barnard's handwritten logbook had more names on it than Mary's. Those families are still waiting. Some of them have been waiting just as long. The fact that this case is solved now is the result of every person who refused to let it disappear. Anita Stinchcomb and her phone calls, Jeffrey Barnard and his logbook, the Saki unit and their grant application, Othram and their lab, 35 years of people who kept going. If this is the kind of investigation you want broken down every week, the forensics, the timeline, the courtroom, all of it, subscribe now. This channel does not do surface level. Drop a comment and tell us, do you think the 1989 investigators missed a real opportunity with that house next door? And tell us where in the world you are watching this from. We read every single one.